Originally, this is going to be a first impressions video, but I beat the game while I was getting everything ready, so now it's a review. I think we're going to start doing multiple tiers of review-related content from now on, those being first impressions. This is generally going to be games that I have not played a majority of the game through, and I'll try to avoid any major spoilers. Reviews, which will be games where I've completed a majority, if not completely finished the game, and will contain spoilers. And then deep dives. This is where I will be going, likely be doing multiple playthroughs, trying to deep dive into mechanics and themes of the game, and obviously will therefore contain major spoilers for the entire game. With that, let's jump into what is now my review of Miasma Chronicles. The controls in this game are not great. Selection and movement feel unintuitive at times, especially when compared to a lot of other games in the genre. I feel like most games, at least those that I have played recently, allow you to select other characters on the map and it will switch to them, or at least do nothing. Here the character will instead move to an adjacent space, usually leaving them in open cover or out of range. This ends up effectively wasting your turn, as you now have to move again to get back into cover or get back into range. I am recording this after coming off of playing Showgunners. While Showgunners has plenty of flaws, it did make up for some of these issues with having turn-based autosaves, which made it very easy to turn back a turn if you made a severe misclick. That is something that I think this game definitely could have benefited from, especially, again, with some of those issues that come down to the way that the UI and interface works inside of combat. Unfortunately, the issues with controls also bleed into the game outside of combat. Primarily, this is frustrating when trying to navigate menus. You can't use the menu hotkeys to switch to different tabs once you're inside of the menus, leaving you to close out the menu and press the other hotkey or use the mouse to navigate. This doesn't usually end up being that big of a deal unless you open the map screen. I hate the map screen, and it's a very big frustration. What you have to do is you have to end up pressing escape 3 times to exit out of the map, as it zooms out with the first 1 or 2 press. Speaking of the map, the game lacks a local area map, which I really don't like. This makes me feel the need to make 1 or 2 loops to recheck and make sure that I explored everything. This ends up feeling like it really slows down the pace of the game. Trying to refocus a bit on the battle systems, I feel like the combat is overall executed well outside of the control issues I mentioned. You are shown hit chances for your current weapon and line of sight markers for targets you can hit where you are hovering to move. While some of the lines of sight don't make sense, you are at least told you can or can't hit the target before moving somewhere. The abilities for each character also add a lot of unique flavor to combat, especially as the game goes later. I am thinking about digs a lot when I say this. You can eventually get to a point where digs can permanently keep 1 unit knocked down for 1 AP every 2 turns. While most of the abilities are things I really enjoyed, one I'm not certain of is Overwatch. This is hidden behind ability unlocks. This felt a little weird as it's a staple of the genre, but I also understand Overwatch spam can be problematic for game design. Jury is out on this, but I wanted to make sure I make a note of it. I really appreciate that there is no cost for refunding skill points, which makes it so you can opt into skills that you aren't enthusiastic about while waiting for points for other skills. This helps with overall scaling and curve of the game as well, since you're not missing out on sort of expected level advancements, while also trying to save points to get to certain skills that you want your characters to have. You also get to try out new abilities without feeling punished, which I can definitely get behind. Being able to sneak around and set up before battles is always fun and does feel very rewarding. It was also almost a necessity on my difficulty to silently take out as many foes as possible before starting combat. On that note, I definitely should have mentioned this earlier, but the difficulty I was playing on, I believe, was challenging, which is the one after normal, and then I also was playing in full tactical. Back to combat again. Unfortunately, the weapons don't feel that good, especially those you unlock through exploration. I found that a lot of the guns I found during exploration were the tier below what I currently had or was finding. The worst part about these unique guns is that it often felt like you were better off selling them. It would have been nice to have some sort of system to keep these weapons relevant as the game goes on. There was also, if I recall correctly, only 2 silenced weapons in the game. While this is probably done to prevent you clearing levels without having a large combat scene, I think it really capped how well those weapons and taking targets down silently worked, especially as the game goes later on. The way they try to get around this seems to be mostly by adding crit to the ambush round where you are getting silent takedowns. This is fine, but it is inherently unpredictable and can lead to a chance for a 95% chance to crit to fail. And now you've aggroed the entire room, and the fight is unplayable for the angle you had to take to get the stealth takedown. And unfortunately, mods aren't much more exciting. As far as purchasing things in the game goes, from my experience, you are much better off purchasing consumables. This is something that is hard for me since I feel conditioned to save and invest in permanent upgrades and changes, but when the weapons give you such minimal progression, it's hard to justify purchasing them, and a lot of the mods that you can buy are also found in plentiful quantities throughout the map just through exploration. There are 1 to 2 that you can buy late game that I think an argument can be made for acquiring, and I definitely got a lot of use out of. Jumping back a moment to ambushes, I did have a couple of issues when exiting ambush. When you exit, all of your party members are teleported to you. I had a few times where I exited ambush and got trapped by teammates, locking me against a wall while I was then spotted by the enemy. This can be overcome by quickly switching to another character, but when you're not expecting it, it can be very frustrating and you don't necessarily think of what to do in that moment. On to design. Design of the characters are really good, and the areas you explore are all very fun and unique. Regarding characters, Elvis is written a bit too naive for me. He's overall enjoyable and has decisions that don't seem wholly inappropriate, but some of the dialogue that leads him to make those decisions ends up leaving something to be desired. Overall, Diggs, big fan. I think Diggs and Jade are up there for 2 of the best written characters and companions in the game. Diggs is just a solid guy that cares for his brother, even if his brother is flesh and blood, and he's a robot. He also has the best read on how to talk to people and deal with adversity, conflict, with those around him. Jade is odd. Overall, her character is enjoyable, but she's supposed to be an incredibly old character. However, she doesn't really behave like it. To me, she does behave more like a 19-year-old who's absorbed a lot of historical information. Balmati is fine. She seems very distant from Elvis, who she later says is like family to her, but also doesn't immediately say that to Elvis. Seems like she wanted him to be upset, I guess. Like, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Mason is the weirdest of all of these characters. He doesn't really seem to fit. And it's not just that he doesn't fit with your party. His character just doesn't seem to fit with the world, especially once you acquire him later on. He goes from abandoning a town searching for immortality to wanting to save the day. And while initially that makes sense because he wants to save the day for selfish reasons, he very quickly seems to become a convert and seems to be shown as a good person, equating his flaws to those of the other party members. Maybe some players will view it that way, but I feel like what Mason had done leading to this point does not equate at all to the mistakes of other party members, which were mostly just issues of not knowing how to communicate with people and be open and vulnerable. A lot of the narrative does make me wonder if there are things lost in translation, as there are a lot of character interactions where I can tell that the intended message tone was supposed to be one thing, but the actual words being spoken seem to be relating to something else that didn't completely match. Aesthetically, I'm a huge fan. It has a beautifully bleak look to it, and the story it tells feels like it fits perfectly. With our current world being torn apart by a growing threat of capitalism, especially for those of us playing in the United States, it can feel very cathartic to enjoy a game where you fight back and attempt to fix the eventual dystopian fallout of those same forces. Counter to that, though, I'm not sure how I feel about the portrayal of some of the locations, specifically in Kentucky. I'm not from Kentucky, and I haven't grown up in rural areas, but it has a weird, somewhat stereotypical vibe to it. Maybe it's accurate, maybe it's a harmless description, I'm not sure. Ultimately, it's not for me to judge, but it is something I noticed and I want to make note of. Now it is time to discuss the most unfortunate part of the game, the technical issues. The game has some performance issues. They're not that big, but it's really noticeable during cutscenes. This was most noticeable to me during the first cutscene of the game. Outside of the cutscenes, the game was fairly stable except during explosions, which would noticeably tank the FPS sometimes. Those issues, while problematic, are at least manageable though. Some of the bigger issues I had were when I alt-tabbed and the UI disappeared. I was only able to continue playing through the game and getting to a point where I could save because I had, at that point, memorized the hotkeys and button presses to get where I needed to. Another is when I tried to break down a wall and Diggs refused to move. I couldn't interact with anything, and I was forced to reload an earlier save. I also noticed issues crashing when trying to enter ambushes. I didn't do a lot of repeat testing, but from what little replication I did, it appears like it may be tied to entering ambushes while on the edge of a battle map. So I think that it has an issue putting characters in a grid space because it tries to push the characters off in different directions, but one of the directions is not on the battle map, and the game just loses its mind and crashes. There are also a lot of weird bugs like Invisible Balmati following you around. I think this has to do with her skin that is made of like collector scraps, but every time I would load into a new area, Balmati's hair would be floating where we spawn at the campfire, and then also in the final battle, I believe it was, no, it wouldn't have been the final battle. In one of the battles near the end, you can see Balmati's floating hair while you're in the actual combat. Unfortunately, there were also some issues in the final fight, and this is the most disappointing part to me. They seem to be, if anything, the most present here for me. And the reason that this sucks is because it's the last thing you remember from the game. I recently completed Cyberpunk 2077, and one of the last fights in that game, I also had massive AI, like NPC bugs, where they just weren't doing anything. They're just standing around letting you shoot them, not moving from their spawn location. And these things really leave like a lasting impression, even if you enjoyed most of the rest of the game. On that, I had issues where abilities were not usable, even though they should have been. This was noticeable with Mindworm, how in one playthrough, I just couldn't use Mindworm. The enemies clearly were able to be Mindwormed. I had just lost and reloaded an earlier attempt on the final fight, and I had used Mindworm in the first fight, but now I couldn't use it for some reason. I had plenty of, I don't remember, energy, I believe it is. I had plenty of energy, but just couldn't use it, even when the targets were in range. So between that and another issue, which I'm about to mention, I ended up having to reload that. And I think I continued to run into bugs like this that kind of made it unplayable, where it was like severely kneecapping my ability to use the game mechanics to finish the last fight. The other issue that was easily repeated and very frustrating was you spawn at the bottom of a set of stairs. You can walk up the stairs, and that is considered to be in the battle map. But if you walk up the stairs, your character then becomes trapped and cannot leave the stairs. This means that your character has no cover and will repeatedly die. I also was unable to throw the grabber, which heals. I would throw the grabber next to my character, adjacent to them, up on top of the stairs. The grabber would refuse to heal them, and it would run down the stairs. Even if the rest of your party was full health, it would just abandon them and run down. This made the stairs just a... It seems like a very obvious place to initially move your sniper, because you can move up and take a shot that first turn. But it was like the largest bait that I have ever seen, because your character just gets trapped. And can no longer move or reposition, and you just have to hope to God that you can hit targets from there. In conclusion, I really like this game in spite of all of the negatives. If you aren't starved for tactics games and don't have a soft spot for capitalist dystopian stories, this may be one you want to avoid, unfortunately. With the technical issues in the game, I can't confidently make a suggestion to purchase it, regardless of how much I personally enjoyed it. With that all said, I'm very much looking forward to see what they come out with next. I was a big fan of Mutant Year Zero, and I really hope to continue to see more tactics games come out from the company, as I've so far very much enjoyed them. Thanks again so much for watching. I hope you'll stick around. If you want to let me know what you thought, feel free to comment below. I will happily engage when it comes to talking about games. If you want to see next videos I post, please subscribe. Thanks again.